or a Sri Lankan, and there's a pretty good chance that he's Vietnamese. He is also, delightfully, American and a Wisconsinite and a Madisonian. And all of these things help to define everything that we love about this place. At its very best, this is an internationalist community. And this is a community that recognizes that the way you interact with the rest of the world is not by launching wars, not by being the now fourth president in a row to bomb Iraq. The way that you solve problems is going into the most difficult places in the world, in the hardest of all circumstances, and seeking first to learn, and second, to find out how you can help, and finally, to propose that there might be a peaceful way out of this mess. And Joe Elder has done that again and again and again around the world at tremendous personal risk and at tremendous cost to his own family and his own experience. He has thrown himself into some of the toughest places in the world with absolutely no military behind him, with absolutely no great economic resources behind him. All he has had behind him is the powerful Quaker religion, which is to say he was pretty much on his own. And maybe the United Nations Association and a few other good folks, but he went there to try and make peace. And I don't think people fully recognize, I know many of you do in this room because you know him, Joe has gone into some of the great conflict regions in the world and met with key players in those regions to try and talk them into seeking peaceful solutions. And there's a good chance that their reaction to that might well be to say, we'll begin with you in showing how we don't do peaceful solutions. But he's gone back again and again. He was a critical player. And he would never say, he would be embarrassed to hear this said. A critical player in trying to advance ideas of peace and reconciliation between India and Sri Lanka. And anybody who understands that conflict understands that when we talk about global conflicts, it's only because our media doesn't cover that part of the world that we don't understand what a big deal that is. Because the violence and the conflict surrounding that, and then the violence and the conflict within Sri Lanka, has been long-term and devastating. And Joe was there as a peace messenger, trying to deliver messages, trying to communicate with people. He did the same thing in Vietnam. Joe Elder went to Vietnam at a time long before a lot of people recognized the horror of that conflict, and saw the possibilities for forging a peace there, and helped to build relationships that matter to this day. And Joe Elder recognized a very, very long time ago that in the Middle East, Israel and Palestine and all the regions around it, that in that region, historically people have actually gotten along. That the truth of the matter is that Jews and Muslims and Christians and also many other religions that claim parts of that space have, through most of history, actually gotten along with one another, actually helped one another to build villages and to start farms and to create communities. And Joe refused to accept that those people who had done that in the past could not do it again. And he became and remains one of the most ardent advocates for a peaceful solution to a conflict in a region where so many other people have given up. He is a remarkable figure. And the key to it is that nothing about Joe would for a second suggest that he's a big deal. Nothing about Joe would for a second suggest that he has ever done anything important, except possibly the quality of his suit, which is he always dresses rather well. No, he knows showing up with a tie on, it throws him off a little bit. And I've seen him on Sunday mornings early when he kind of like, kind of flashes into the Quaker meeting and everybody's sort of dressed in, sort of the the chic, non-glamorous Quaker clothing. It's basically, sweaters made out of dryer lint. And then here's Joe in his suit. And, we all had to listen to him because we have no hierarchies, patriarchy or anything like that. But still, he's got a suit on. So anyways, the bottom line is that at some fundamental level, Joe Elder has gone into these conflicts, has gone into some of the most complex and difficult parts of the world with very little standing beyond his own humanity and beyond his own faith, that if you actually treat people well and you talk to them about what they could be, they might decide to be that. And if you look at his 53 years, I know he taught at the university, and I know from experience that there are professors across this country that revere him as the transitional figure in their life. I know he's spent a lot of time at the State Department. There are people at the State Department who revere him as the one person who can really explain Southern Asia and help people to start to think about how they might actually do meaningful diplomacy there. I know all of the important things on the resume, but I will tell you this. The most vital reality of Joe Elder is that he has spent his lifetime as a peacemaker. He has spent his lifetime believing that you can forge peace on any part of this planet. And I can't imagine any other embodiment of the United Nations so significant as that. Because at the end of the day, if we don't make peace, nothing else is possible. And so I close off in introducing Joe, and Todd did such a nice reference to Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt had a wonderful speech that she gave in 1951, or 1958, I apologize, and it was in our hands. And many of you know elements of the speech. But she said something that was so critical, is where, after all, do human rights begin? In small places close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerned citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. I would suggest to you that there is no one I have ever met in covering diplomats and presidents and senators and academics and clergy. There is no one I have ever met who has so well embodied that statement as Joe Elder, because Joe Elder has been willing to go to the villages. He's been willing to go to the remote crossroads. He's been willing to go to the ends of the earth to preach a gospel of peace and reconciliation. And to my mind, if we had more Joe Elders, we would be at peace today. But if we are ever to be at peace, it will be because of people like Joe Elder. And in fact, let us take the word "like" out. It will be because of Joe Elder. Please welcome my friend and mentor, Joe Elder.
Thank you, John. And I thank you for referring to one of my favorite quotes from Eleanor Roosevelt. I actually thought of using the same quote.
I hope it...
It's not there, no. But it's a wonderful quote, the notion that human rights begin with two people, three people, and expand from there to the groups. Tonight I want to talk about sort of a view of the United Nations from the point of view of a sociologist. That's what my training has been. Also a Quaker, and I have that sort of spin to it. But I'm interested in efforts that people make to create new institutions to handle problems. So almost from the very beginning when the UN was founded, the idea was, could we come up with something that might actually be able to prevent wars from happening, that might actually be able to improve the living of so many millions of people? So it's as a sociologist looking at an institution that I'm going to be talking tonight. And I'm calling it the United Nations as a work in progress. We're going to go back to the founding of the UN and look at what it was set up to do, and then watch over the years how the goals have remained pretty constant, but the efforts to address them have had to be adapted and modified because the world is indeed complicated. I'm enough of a teacher, so I've given you a handout. I did that because I think if you don't have the handout, my talk is going to get very, very confusing. It'd be confusing enough anyway. But there is a structure to it, and I'm going to try to pack a lot of things in. So if you do want to put up the notes and follow them, you don't have to write anything. But I think if you see the way in which I tried to set it up, I picked the 4 goals that were identified for the UN in the beginning. And then we're going to walk through the decades since then to see in which the way those goals have been modified or adapted. And then look at the very confusing situation we're in right now, where some of the goals are being challenged and some new problems have come up. And I will end up putting in a little plug for the UN Association. So we begin by identifying the 4 basic tasks in the UN Charter. And they've been around for so long that they're almost biblical when you refer to them. The first of those charges is to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The world had just gone through a second horrendous war, and the leaders of Britain and the Soviet Union and the United States felt we should be bright enough not to go through this again. And so the very first goal was to end the scourge of war, and we can stop right there if we have to say, has the UN succeeded? Obviously not. There have been wars and wars and wars and wars since 1945. But we're also going to look at ways in which some of them have been stopped and some may have been prevented. Second goal was to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights and in the equal rights of men and women and all nations, large and small. These are fairly radical ideas. Again, these were the ideas of those who had seen the Second World War and all that it had done. The third of the goals was to establish respect for treaties and other sources of international law. I remember as an undergraduate taking a course in international law and being told very early on there is no international law. There are traditions and practices, but there's not an ultimate sort of parliament, an ultimate police force that enforces these things. So to the extent there is an international law, it's kind of an agreement among people that for the time being we will relate to each other in certain ways. The fourth of those goals was to promote social progress and better standards of life. I've excerpted the core parts because each of these had somewhat longer sentences. Eleanor Roosevelt was careful to include many subpoints, but I'm trying to sort of pull out just the key points to sort of see where we are today. The major precondition for the United Nations was the concept of national sovereignty. Back at the end of the 30-Year War in Europe, 1648, the Treaty of Westphalia was established, and without, I think, our realizing how important that was, this set up the concept of national sovereignty, which hadn't existed quite the same way at that time, and which has become almost a truism that if you are a nation, you are a sovereign nation, and certain things can and cannot happen. The agreement that was drawn up at the end of the 30 Years' War was that what happens in a nation's borders is that nation's business. Up until then, a Protestant country could look at a Catholic country and see the Protestants were being persecuted, and they'd use that as an excuse to go into the Catholic country, or vice versa. And the agreement finally was, let's set boundaries. It may not be happy, we may not like what we see, but if it's in that country has the responsibility for it, and we can't use what they're doing as a justification for us to move in. And it did bring about a piece of a sword in Europe, which has lasted sort of up to the major period right now, with a couple of horrible periods in between. So nations, if they were going to join, would join only with the understanding that we are sovereign. Nobody can tell us what we do in our country, but we will accept the other side of that, which is we can't tell you what to do in your country. So you start from the beginning with this notion of disparate countries, their own boundaries, and the notion, don't tell me what to do, and in return, I won't tell you what to do. And one might say, in 1945, that's not a very promising basis with which to establish anything. Now we're going to fast forward. We're going to go over 60 years and look at to what extent any of those goals have been achieved. Now I'm going to turn the order backwards just because in terms of presenting the issues, history works out in a backward fashion. So let's begin with the fourth of those goals, the promotion of better standards of life. And I call this a work in progress because as the years have passed, some things have been tried, some things worked, and one or two things failed pretty badly. If we look at the promotion of better standards of life and the work in progress, by now, some of those institutions have been around so long, it's hard to picture a world without them. The WHO, the World Health Organization. The Ebola crisis would be 1,000 times worse if it weren't for the fact that there is a World Health Organization. The fact that germs and viruses transcend national borders without visas or any kind of permits. The UNHCR, if there were an organization which I think the UN High Commission for Refugees is the one that at the moment probably is keeping, give or take, 8 or 10 million people alive. These are people who fled their countries, these are people who are displaced, and the fact that they have shelter, they have clothing, they have medical assistance, they have education is a result of something that was established way back there. There must be a place for refugees. And ironically and sadly, there are millions and millions of refugees every year. UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Social, and Cultural Organization. I actually, for a time, served on the U.S. Commission to UNESCO. This is the one that looks at national and international heritages, the pyramids, the Borobudur Palace, the great relics of the Mesopotamia. It says these are treasures of the world, and we must protect them and keep them alive for future generations. So there is a remarkable track record of organizations and activities that have promoted the better standards of life. Perhaps the most dramatic one is the decision several years ago to establish the Millennium Development Goals. This is probably the first time that the nations of the world have said, look, we have great resources and we have vast disparities of wealth. Let's work together to say in 15 years we would like to have this many people fed well, this many kids going to school, this many people who have the kind of medical assistance that they need. It's been a struggle in terms of how close we've come. We'll know technically next year, 2015, but in some ways, the fact that the world worked together to reduce poverty, reduce hunger, and to improve health is quite remarkable, and it's done collectively and done by sovereign nations, each of which in a sense said, you can't tell me what to do. So that was the fourth of the goals. The third of the goals, respect for treaties and other sources of international law. Work in progress here, again, is very difficult. This is not, we don't have an international nation, we don't have a judicial body, we don't have police, we don't have an army. So how does one have international law? One looks to some extent at the charter itself to see what the planners, the Roosevelts and Stalins and Churchills, tried to come up with. And chapter 14 of the charter says there shall be an international court of justice. And the purpose of that court was to address disputes between countries. We're going to see as we go through this that the issue of individual responsibility and individual crimes comes up later. But at this point, it's countries disputing with each other. Why must you go to war if you could, in a sense, say, let's look at what the issues are, let's see what the treaties are, and let's come up with something that we can accept as historically accurate. So these have been disputes between nations. One of the weaknesses is that it's optional. The International Court can't say you